Hi, welcome to Conversations with Hannah. I'm joined here today by Beth Casavant, who's a Library Board of Trustee, town meeting member, and PTO president of the Sherwood Oak Middle School, among many other things that you do. And I asked Beth to join me today because we're going to be talking about what's going on in Beacon Hill. There's a lot going on, and so I thought it would be good if maybe we could have a conversation about it.
Great.
We're about 2 months into the first of the year. The new session has started, and there's a whole host of things going on. I'm sure people have seen things in the paper, but thought we could spend a little time and go over some of them.
Yeah, great. I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me on your show. You're certainly very busy. In November, you were elected to your second term with about 75% of the vote in Shrewsbury and Westboro, and I had the honor of attending your first swearing in 2015. What was different about being sworn in this time as compared to when you won in the special election?
Yeah, the special was very unique and very special because there was only 2 of us being sworn in. So we had the pleasure of being up front with the governor being sworn in, as you saw, and I was able to have about 50 people come and attend. This year, I was able to basically have 1 person come and attend and sit next to me down on the floor. So my husband Jim came, and that was great. And up in the House balcony, it was really the turn for the freshman legislators to have their family and friends. So they each got to bring 6 or 8 people each, and then we all got sworn in together. It's a very long process. It's about 3 hours from start to finish because you're not just getting sworn in as a legislator. You're sort of, in this year, you're starting the whole new process of, in our case, the 190th biennium session of the Great and General Court. So you're going through the procedures of setting up the session for the next 2 years. So, you know, a lot of it is some pomp and circumstance, and then a lot of it is what we're constitutionally called to do. So one of the things that's fun is they will convene committees of certain legislators. They'll call you down, and then you'll get tasked to go do something. So I was part of a committee that was pulled together to go let the speaker know that we had assembled ourselves in the House chamber and was ready for him to come in after we had voted on him being elected the speaker. And then I was also sent on the committee to the Senate to let the Senate know that we had formed ourselves and were ready to alert them. So, you know, when you think about the history of it and think, you know, a couple hundred years ago, there were people walking these same halls who didn't have texting or any of the modern communication.
The Senate and told them it was time.
So it's really, I loved sort of walking from the House chamber down to the Senate chamber and just thinking about who else has walked these halls, who else was in these committees years ago that got tasked to go do this. So, well, it was certainly a long day. 3 hours in is a long time to sit in your seat, especially when you're shoved in with extra people sitting next to you. It was great to be able to go through it. I'd gone with Matt 3 times when he got sworn in, so it was, I had seen it.
So you knew what to
expect.
expect.
So I knew what to expect. And then, you know, part of what you're doing as well is on that day, Republicans were voting for the minority leader. We voted unanimously for Brad Jones to be reelected as minority leader. And then when you're in the House chamber, you're voting, all legislators are voting on who they want as speaker. So very much a party line vote. All the Democrats voted for Speaker DeLeo to be elected speaker. All the Republicans voted for our leader, Brad Jones, to be elected, which we knew he wouldn't be. But that's part of what you're doing in that day. You're also, you know, it's great to have the governor come in and swear you in, the lieutenant governor. You have the Senate come in as well, the governor's council. So it's really, you know, it's a historical day in the sense that you're experiencing it, but you're also thinking through all the people that have gone before you and served in that body, having experienced it as well.
Yeah. It's wonderful that those traditions remain intact, even with the times changing. It's great. So you mentioned to me that you had 2 weeks to file all of your bills. Can you tell me what that process is like?
It's really one that, until you've experienced it, it's really hard to indicate just how crazy it is. So we basically have 2 weeks to file all of our bills. And many of these bills we've each been working on, you know, for months to prepare for that time. But you essentially have to get everything into what's called our system, our laws system, filed. And over the course of those 2 weeks, there was 5,700 bills filed, 3,700 in the House and just over 2,000 in the Senate.
Okay. That's a lot of bills.
It is a lot of bills. And then what happens, so you get all your bills in on that second Friday by 5, and then that following Monday morning, you start corresponding with your colleagues to try and get co-sponsors. So, I was sending out emails to my colleagues asking them to be co-sponsors of my bills. I'm getting all the emails from my colleagues asking me to be co-sponsors of their bills. In addition, you have all the special interest groups who want you to co-sponsor bills, so they're emailing you, and then constituents are emailing you. Okay. So the volume of email in that period of time, most days I was getting around 300 to 400 emails. Wow. And I try and answer every email personally. So keeping up with sort of the volume of just the emails and then looking into the different bills, because many times I'm getting emailed about a bill that I might not know off the top of my head. So then I'm researching it, looking to see what it's about, and then getting back to that person on whether or not it's something that I would want to sponsor, and if I'm not going to sponsor, what was my reasoning. At the same time, I had a new legislative aide starting who's terrific. Her name's Jessica Bellevue, but it was really baptism by fire for this poor girl. She started just as the session started. So working together, you're really slogging away for a couple weeks. And I filed bills that were both bills that had a local interest. So one of them I filed was for the Lake Quinsigamond Commission, looking to give them some additional powers in terms of management on the lake and some clarity around where they can hold hearings. I filed one on out-of-district pupil transportation, which is important for the Shrewsbury school system, because as you know, we tuition in our students to Assabet. We're not a member of the regional school district. And so there's a certain line item that helps reimburse cities and towns that are under that same way of tuitioning in their students. Right. Historically, that's been very underfunded. It's one of the things that I fight for each year during the budget process, is to try and get it funded. But I filed language that would allow us to charge students who travel to Assabet a bus fee, because as of today, we're not allowed to do that.
Right.
Because
there's no bus fee.
No, originally the legislation said because the Commonwealth is going to pay for busing, you can't charge anyone a bus fee. But because the Commonwealth isn't keeping up its commitment of funding this line item and reimbursing the town, I put in language that basically would allow the town to charge the same rate for a bus fee as I pay and you pay in order for our kids to access the bus. And again, it's important for the town of Shrewsbury. We spend about $177,000 a year on the 3 buses that transport kids to and from Assabet. So to lose that incremental funding source at both the state level and not have a way to get some of the funding at the town level is difficult. I filed things that would help protect cities and towns and school departments from unfunded mandates, which would essentially require that every bill that we pass have a fiscal study note on it, indicating sort of what the financial cost was going to be to cities and towns to comply with it. That was something that I co-filed with a Democratic colleague of mine, and we'll work across the aisle to try and get that through. And then I filed things, things come up to us as legislators throughout the session. So last session, I had a constituent who had a very unfortunate dog kennel issue where her dog was actually killed at a dog kennel by another dog. And part of the reason was there was some lapse in terms of some of the maintenance and some of the upkeep there. And when we looked into it, there wasn't a lot of clarity regarding what's mandated in terms of making sure that kennels are appropriate licensed and have all of the appropriate safeguards in place to do that work.
You wouldn't even think about it, really.
No, I had not either, but she brought that forward. There had been a piece of legislation that someone else had filed who had a similar experience with another constituent. I worked on it last year. It didn't end up getting reported out of committee, but I refiled that bill again with the same colleague, and we'll begin working on that. And one of the things that's interesting is out of the 5,700 bills that get filed every year, generally 4 to 5% of them might make it all the way through to get passed. And the majority of them don't. And a lot of bills need to get filed in multiple sessions before they gain traction or get movement. So, it's important that you understand that. And I also spend a lot of time talking to constituents about that just because you file something doesn't mean it's going to get all the way through. There's just so many competing bills, and there's a finite amount of time of legislators to deal with all of these bills. I also filed bills that I hope will strengthen the marijuana legalization that the voters voted in November. One of my concerns when I was an advocate against question 4 was that I didn't think it had enough public safety and public health controls in it, and I was worried that the local control wasn't appropriate for cities and towns, meaning that the way question 4 was structured to legalize marijuana, if you didn't want to have it in your community, you had to have a community-wide vote to opt out of it.
Right.
We don't do that with any other sort of mechanism around zoning or ordinance. We deal with that at the legislative, in our case, town meeting member level. So one of the bills I filed was to make sure that town meeting could vote on that, or city council, depending on whatever your legislative body is. And I also filed some bills on it around the structure of the commission. Rather than being embedded in the treasurer's office with a 3-member commission, I felt it was important that moving ahead, the governor, the attorney general, and the treasurer each had appointments to it, and then 2 of them would be a co-appointment. The reason I think that's important is because when you have one constitutional office holder sort of in charge of the commission, it makes it much easier for that industry to control that one constitutional office holder through raising funds for someone who's running against somebody. When you have it spread out and the power to appoint commissioners is divided among many different office holders, it makes it that much more difficult for sort of the regulatory capture to happen.
It's like a checks and balance.
Yes, yep. So I filed 12 bills around those areas. And again, I was spending a lot of time seeking out my own co-sponsors for my bills, as well as evaluating bills that my colleagues had filed. And in the end, I filed 24 bills altogether, and I co-sponsored almost 300. So again, you have the 2 weeks to file, and then you have the 2 weeks to do co-sponsorship. In that same time frame, as we're getting all of these emails from everybody regarding bill filing, the governor's budget had come out, so you're also getting calls regarding that. And then obviously there's a lot going on at the national level, and people were concerned about that, so our offices were also getting called. So it's always a busy time when you start in the first year of the 2-year session, but right now it seems particularly crazy. And then other fun started at the State House after that.
Well, knowing you read up and learned about all those 300 bills that you co-sponsored, and that's a very time-consuming task.
They're really varied, and they're sort of all over the place. I mean, part of it is I always look to bills that I feel really help me in terms of what my priorities are. So I had filed 2 food donation bills myself. One of them was around sort of extending liability protection to people who are donating food, and another was on food labeling, because I want to make sure we can, A, donate as much food as possible to people in need, and B, we're reducing food waste, because that's another huge problem that we have. And a lot of that work comes not only from the charitable work that I've tried to do in Shrewsbury and Westboro, but also I'm sitting on the Mass Food Policy Council right now, and so I work on a lot of the issues relative to food policy in Massachusetts, and those were 2 areas that I felt strongly about. But I looked at sort of what was legislation that was being filed that would help our farms, because farming and agriculture are a keen interest of mine. What were bills relative to schools that I thought would be important. In the public health realm, one of the bills that I worked on last year, and I'm working on again on this year, is students who need to be able to give themselves glucagon shots after school when there isn't a nurse around. Right now, no one else is supposed to be able to help them, and if they're experiencing a situation where their blood sugar has changed and they're entering into a period of critical life and death, honestly, what are the rules around who could help them do that? We need clarity on the state level about that. And that's, again, an issue that was brought to me by several constituents in town who had a concern for their own children in the school system. And, when you start to look into some of these issues, you realize there's people across the state who also are having a similar problem. And then obviously I'm always looking for ways to alleviate the pressures on cities and towns. Being a finance committee member in Shrewsbury, I'm very aware of the power we have as a state to be either very helpful or very not helpful to cities and towns.
Yeah, definitely. Very good. You mentioned that these bills get sent to committees.
Yeah.
So who is on these various committees, and how is it decided who serves on committees?
So ultimately, the speaker will decide for the Democrats what committees they sit on, and the minority leader decides which committees we sit on as Republicans. My minority leader, Brad Jones, sends out an email with sort of all the committees on it and asks us to, either come meet with him or give feedback as to what our interests are. Last session, I was on the Joint Committee on Transportation and the Joint Committee on Public Health, and I did request to stay on those 2 committees. And I also requested to be added to a new committee, which is a committee on marijuana, which is being formed, where I'm hoping to be the ranking minority member on that. there's 27 joint committees, which means it's made up of both House and Senate members. And then each body also has their own committees. So in the House, I'm also on 2 House committees. One is the Committee on Redistricting, which we don't have a lot to do when it's not a census year. And the other is Personnel and Administration. And one of the things we do on that committee is work on the internship program we have every summer at the State House. So I find that to be really interesting and rewarding. And I offer to stay on those as well. We are hoping to find out this week. You vote on it, within your caucus. So the leadership puts out who they think should chair and be vice chair and members of committees, and then each caucus will vote on their own. So it's anticipated that we know this week. And then that way the clerks in the House and the Senate, they can start to send committees out to the appropriate committee. Sometimes it's difficult for clerks to decide where to send a bill. So for instance, we're hoping that all the bills that were filed that had to do with marijuana will come to the Committee on Marijuana. But I filed a bill that had to do with public safety issues regarding marijuana in terms of how do we judge impairment when someone's driving. Theoretically, the clerk could decide that makes more sense to go to the Committee on Public Safety. So the clerks have a lot of power to decide where a bill is going to go and end up. But we basically have a year. So once our committee gets formed and the bills get sent to us, hearings will get scheduled. And a year from now, in March of 2018, all bills will need to be dealt with by their committees, meaning it either needs to be reported out and on to another committee or on to House Ways and Means, or it needs to be sent to study, which is essentially a nice way of killing the bill. Or no action is taken on it, or sometimes we vote actually to not send a bill forward, which also kills the bill. Sometimes you can get extensions. There were bills that were worked on in our committees right up through the end of June, but that's usually a very small number of the bills that you've seen as a committee. For the most part, they're all dealt with. One of the reasons that there's the urgency to file at the beginning of the session is because when we file by the deadline in January, they're called seasonably filed bills, and they're guaranteed a public hearing. I can file a bill anytime during the session moving forward, but it's considered a late file. And what that means is I'm not guaranteed that my bill will get a hearing. They typically do. For the most part, it's very functional in that way. A lot of the bills that you would see filed after this period of time are either bills that have come up because something's happened. So in March and April of 2015, when we had everything that was going on with all of the snow and the MBTA was not working, and there was a conclusion that something needs to be done here, then you had the governor filing a bill on how to reform the MBTA. You also have things like home rule petitions that get filed later on in the session. So Senator Moore and I moved a bill through that was filed late for a home rule petition to get the additional liquor license to the town of Shrewsbury so that we could give that to Whole Foods. So those things will still go on, and home rule petitions are given sort of special consideration. Everyone understands there's a timing sensitivity to those, so those tend to move pretty quickly. But once the committees are assigned, I'll get hearing schedules and I'll be very busy.
So are those the bills that can be talked about even when there's not a formal session, the ones that come in later?
Yeah, we are in formal session. So in this year, which is our first year of our session, we're in formal session through the end of July. And then we come back in the fall, and we have to be done the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. And then we'll be out of formal session again until January of 2018. In between, we always have informal sessions every Monday and Thursday. Again, we have to. That's part of how we operate. And in those informal sessions, non-controversial bills can go through, which basically mean both the leadership in the House and the Democrats and the Republicans have allowed the bill to be moved to the floor. But one person can hold a bill up. So it could be that Republican leadership and Democratic leadership think the bill is good and can move ahead in informal. But if there's one of my colleagues who disagrees with that bill moving forward, all they need to do is sit in the session, the informal session, and doubt the presence of a quorum. And that way the bill cannot move. But things like home rule petitions, liquor licenses, things like that, those almost always, sick leave bills, that's another thing that we file a lot. Those always move through in informal sessions and usually without any controversy at all.
Interesting. I read the Globe editorial that you wrote that came out on January 1st, talking about the need for the mid-year 9C cuts that the governor made. You made some excellent points. What prompted the need for the cuts?
So one of the things that's happened the last couple of years is each December, the House Ways and Means Chairman, the Senate Ways and Means Chairman, as well as the Administration Secretary, Christine Lepore, they meet and they bring in lots of different advisors and folks, economists, and they develop what's called a consensus revenue number, which essentially means this is the amount of increase we believe we'll have next year in terms of tax increase revenue coming in that we can base building a budget on for the following fiscal year. So what's happened the last few years is that consensus revenue number has ended up being higher than what has come in through tax revenue collection. And it's really not income tax or sales tax or any of those other taxes. They've been performing okay. It's been the capital gains tax, which has not been performing at the levels that people anticipated at. So the governor, by law, has to always ensure that our budget doesn't exceed the revenues available. And so again, this year, what had happened is, after a couple months in, our taxes, the collections each month weren't at the level necessary to sustain the spending that had been agreed to by the House and the Senate and the governor. So the governor has what's called 9C power, and that's his authority to try and bring it back into balance, where he can cut things in the executive office level under his control. And it's not anything that anyone ever likes to do. It's very difficult. And we had talked about it with the governor in October. He wanted to hold off from making the cuts. He wanted to see another month or two of tax revenue collection to see if it would be made up. And then it became clear that that wasn't going to happen. So the governor cut 0.25% of the overall $39.5 billion budget. In the $98 million, it hurts. It hurts all of those different groups that are relying on those funds. And there were things in there that were a priority for me that got cut.
Right.
But ultimately, the reason why I wrote the Globe editorial is because I thought that the governor was doing the right thing. And sometimes I think it's important to remind people that when the governor and lieutenant governor took office, they were facing a $765 million mid-year budget crisis. Deval Patrick had already cut as governor, had done some 9C cuts of his own in the fall, and that still just wasn't enough to correct the lack of revenue coming in. And then going into the fiscal year 16 budget, there was almost a $1.8 billion deficit that had to be closed. And, again, one of the promises that the Baker-Polito administration has made is to not use funds in the rainy day fund, which had been happening for 8 straight years under Governor Deval Patrick. So instead of putting money in, money was coming out of that rainy day fund, which wasn't helpful. And to also cut down the amount of funds that were sort of one-time revenue sources, because again, they're just not sustainable, they're one-offs. And so in the midst of also dealing with less revenue coming in, the administration is also trying to sort of correct and make stronger our budgeting process each year. And then they also, have kept their campaign promise, which was to ensure that whatever percent increase we see in tax revenue is directly matched to the increase in local aid that cities and towns are getting. And so they have kept that promise. And this year, I think it's 3.9% increase in terms of the funds that we're looking at it, that we're anticipating from tax revenue, and that we're also promising to cities and towns. The governor filed his budget on Wednesday the 25th. On Tuesday the 24th of January, he did his State of the State, and we all listened to sort of what his priorities were. And then his budget is out. Typically what happens is the House budget, when that comes out, which is in April, that's usually the budget that is most closely aligned with what the final budget will be. So the governor introduces his budget in January, the House introduces our budget in April, the Senate introduces their budget in May. After both the House and the Senate vote on their budgets, it's then sent to what's called a conference committee, and it's made up of members of both the House and the Senate, and they take the two different budgets and they try and create one that blends the priorities of both chambers. And then that budget comes back to each chamber, and we have an up or down vote on it, basically. We can't play with it anymore. It's either we take the advice of our conference committee of what they've brought to us and we vote for it, or we vote against it.
So you take the whole thing or none of it.
Right. And then that conference committee agreed upon budget gets sent to the governor's office. The governor then can decide if he wants to use line item veto to strike out things that he might not have agreed with. Because the difference between the governor's budget when he started and our final conference committee budget, it does have different priorities, because the governor is sort of filing a budget that prioritizes what he believes needs to happen in the state as a whole. But individual legislators are also looking out for their own districts. So at times you have priorities in there that you believe are important for the area that you represent. So I think there was about 300 items that the governor had vetoed out of the budget that we voted this last year. So then we come back into session in the House and the Senate, and we deal with some of the overrides. This year they brought up about half of them. So they might let some of them stand. They might decide it's not worth the fight, and they'll just let the governor's line item stand. But about 150 or 160 of the vetoes he had were brought back to the House, and we voted on them again. I try as much as possible to uphold the governor's vetoes and things like that. But again, there's priorities for the district, and if there's something that I believe is a priority, or I've heard from an overwhelming number of people, then I will, vote against it and vote to override the governor's veto instead of sustaining it. So it is a long process. It
sounds long.
Yeah, it basically starts in December and ends the end of July, and then you have like 3 or 4 months off, and it starts all over again.
It's like the bulk of your work.
Yes, a lot of it.
Mm-hmm. So in light of the 9 seat cuts we just talked about, the gap in the budget, tax revenue not being what's expected, in the news is the legislative voting on pay raises. And so there's many people that are questioning how that can be. What's your take? Because I'm sure it's a deeper issue than what we see.
So there's a number of things with this. I was very, I wasn't pleased with the fact that it all moved so quickly. I mean, some people say, well, there were 2 reports done for many years about the fact that legislative pay needed to be dealt with. But the bottom line is there wasn't sort of a true public hearing process on this. And one of the things that frustrates me as somebody who sometimes likes to move very quickly on things is that we can have a very slow approach to dealing with things at the State House, and yet this was something that had moved through incredibly quickly. The Speaker filed a bill on a Monday. It got heard in House Ways and Means on a Tuesday, voted out, and we dealt with it in the House chamber on a Wednesday. You just don't see that happening. And there was a lot in this pay raise package. One of the things that they did is they got rid of per diems for legislators, which I was fine with getting rid of per diems. I never took one to begin with, but I thought that was a good idea. But they did increase the stipend for rank and file legislators. And most people are unaware of essentially everything that happens in our office is paid for by us. So when I do a mailing to constituents, I'm buying the stamps. When I present a citation, I've bought the citation cover and the things, my business cards, my aide's business card, all of those things are things that we pay for out of pocket. So the stipend is meant to offset some of those costs for us. That had not been increased since 1984, so that was one of the things that got dealt with. But by and large, unfortunately, the pay raises largely went to people in leadership positions, committee chairs, and vice chairs. And that is where I think that you saw people really outraged at the fact that this could be happening so quickly and that it was such a high amount of money being approved. In the House, we put a thing in, you could only take 1 stipend. In the Senate, they're allowing themselves to take 3 stipends. So if they're a committee chair, they can get a stipend. If they're a vice chair on another one, they can take that stipend. And if they're in leadership, they can take a 3rd. To me, that's just completely egregious. So I voted against the pay raise. And I think it's something, quite frankly, that is going to linger as an issue, and I do expect it to be something that constituents are talking about for a very long period of time. I did hear from a lot of them, and they were very happy that I voted against it, but I've also tried to tell people that, this is something where, it's both the nature of what we were voting on and how quickly it happened that I really was troubled by. And we're almost out of time, and I want to make sure that people understand that you have big things going on in your life right now. You're running for Board of Selectmen for the open seat that Henry Fitzgerald is not running for re-election.
Yes, open seats don't come along very often in Shrewsbury, so I decided to take advantage of the opportunity, and I'm very hopeful to be able to fill that seat on the May 2nd municipal election.
Well, I think you're going to do a terrific job, and I'm excited for you, and will do anything I can to help you in that endeavor.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. Your support has always meant a lot to me.
Thank you. I'm glad we could be together today. Of course, we've run out of time to talk about a whole host of other things, so we'll have to do it again. But thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you all real soon on another Conversations with Hannah.